And the conversation turns to summer travel. I mentioned that I'm going to Israel. The chair of the department, who was a nice French woman, looks at me with disapproval. I tell the table just now, because now I'm getting testy, I'll say, oh yes, I'm a big Zionist. To which she recoils with visible disgust and kind of an indiscernible utterance to match. She bites her tongue, but had she not bit her tongue, she probably would have said something very unnice. At that same dinner, another senior professor colleague introduces me to someone else from another department. I think it was English. And this professor looks at me squarely and says, wow, I didn't realize we're still letting Israelis on campus. Of course, I'm stunned by this, but I can't issue a comeback, right? I'm like an adjunct. I'm trying to position myself to get a tenure-track position. I'm trying to be nice. And there's really no way to kind of fly off the handle at that. Flash forward, to my 8th year, last year, not one but 2 tenure-track positions come up. But I only find out about them online in an ad. And I can assure you it wasn't because of my teaching, because I always had the highest evaluations in the department. So I'm overlooked, and I leave. School number 3. I'm running out of schools here in the New York area to teach. This one's at Pratt. Pratt, another great art school. The chair of the art education department where I'm teaching jokes to everyone present when he joyfully exclaims at a department meeting, where else can an Israeli and an Iranian get along like this? He's Iranian, of course. Meant to demonstrate the fact that, as a chair, he is a benevolent and tolerant figure, like the king of Persia himself. This again is my boss, who can either assign me or not assign me, right, to further teaching. And so one wonders, do you hide the fact that you're from Israel? To get ahead, how do you navigate this? Just to keep your measly little adjunct course, which, sometimes pays as little as $2,500 for the semester. For reasons that are still unclear, I was laid off from that job as well. School number 4, this is my last school. I'm teaching art history online at a small college. I never get to meet the students, just outside of Washington, D.C. And in the safety of the online environment, of course, a few students take the opportunity to do the usual Israel bashing. Now, these students are very young, right, like you, but probably unlike you, they know less, right, than you about the Middle East. And you can tell that they're kind of regurgitating stuff that they've heard. And frankly, it's completely off topic, right? I asked them, like, how did the Renaissance aesthetic affect the fledgling Baroque art? And they say, well, Israel, you just can't get away from it, right? Some art world examples, moving away from academia. I'm involved in the art world in New York. I'm going to the New Museum in Soho. It's called the New Museum. Shortly after it opens. And on the 3rd floor, there's an installation by a young artist who's envisioning the year 2048, when Israel no longer exists. And I'm told by the didactic panel in the museum that he's not anti-Israel, but that he's just exploring political realities. This makes me very mad. And I decide to slip a little note into the museum exhibition. Now, I'm an artist, I work at museums, and this is highly illegal. But I just decided to do it anyway. Come on in. So I love the idea of when he takes down his installation, he'll find a little note for me. Okay, so then after calming down, I go down to the museum bookstore, to the gift store downstairs, where on cue, I'm browsing through the gift store, and I find a stack of prominently displayed DVDs about the terrible Israeli aggression in Gaza. This is in the museum bookstore, right there with the postcards, the Van Gogh postcards, and and the calendars. And mind you, this is about 10 feet away from a plaque where all of the supporters are listed. And let's face it, 90 to 95% of them are Jewish names, who are responsible for this, buyers, whoever's buying the merchandise at the gift store, they're responsible for their salaries and their livelihood. I thought of doing a little performance piece where I buy all the CDs and I go out right in front of the museum and I smash them with a hammer, but I never did. I never did that. Art World incident number 2. In the mid-90s, I was sitting on a panel with a very famous artist, very famous, prominent American, nice Jewish lady. And flash forward, we're now Facebook friends, and her wall, however, is constantly ablaze with anti-Israel remarks that are constantly liked by her Art World groupies and worshippers. So I decided to take them on, and this kind of devolves into a very public, very ugly kind of battle on Facebook with like the who's who of the New York Art World, ridiculing me and reprimanding me for not having the right politics. So this really affects your Art World career, where everybody, it seems, is a very politically astute, very extremely easily offended, postmodern, lefty activist. Bless you. Now, a few days later, I have to walk by her artwork at the Metropolitan Museum, where I'm a tour guide. I'm a lowly tour guide, and I have to walk by it, and it's just so humiliating. Which leads me to incident number 3. At the Metropolitan Museum, which I'm sure you've all been to, the education department is using a map of the Middle East for teaching purposes. Of course, Israel is nowhere to be found. When I'm alone in the office, I take a big fat Sharpie and I write it in. And it gave me great pleasure, I have to say. But one of the worst incidents in memory at the Met was the curators of the Alexander McQueen show. Do you know Alexander McQueen? It was the most popular show we'd ever had, ever in the history of the Met, including like the traveling of the Mona Lisa, etc. For one of the Alexander McQueen video installations, they decide to use a theme from Schindler's List. This is one of the things that really shocks me, because every time I hear the first note of that thing, I fall apart and into tears. I just had this very visceral response to that piece. It's a beautiful piece by John Williams. And I'm thinking, could you not find another piece of music to use, one that was not specifically written for the slaughter of 6 million Jews? And by the way, this was under the directorship of a new new president of the museum who is British. Yes, it was, the curators decided, but it was, I think the president has to, or the director has to put a stamp of approval on it. Which, that's another issue I have. Do we not have, out of the 350 million people in the US, do we not have anyone to hire as a museum director? But that's another issue. Right, and you guys, I could go on and on and on, but I don't want to bore you, and I know that you've probably heard of this and you've experienced it yourself. The internet, you go on YouTube, you go on these sites, and you see the kinds of comments that you get, and you take the temperature of the culture, and it's very, very scary, right? Every morning now in New York, I have to listen to the BBC. And now Al Jazeera America. I mean, again, do we not have journalists? What is going on here? The New York Times, right? What used to be the paper of record is now the same as all the others. Very anti-Israel, very, very unsympathetic, very unfair. My Brooklyn Food Co-op wants to boycott my Israeli hummus. My HSBC ATM machine greets me in Arabic and is laundering money to terrorists. And now, and this is the most up to date, my Metropolitan Opera is glorifying terrorism in this production of The Death of Klinghoffer. which opens tonight and which is receiving a very vocal and very vigorous response in the form of a protest tonight at Lincoln Center as we speak. This nice gentleman is actually looking through the Twitter feed, and he's going to update us.
Nothing new.
Hmm?
Nothing new yet.
So you guys, what is going on? You know, what's a man to do with all this frustration and alienation? Beyond the bias and the insults, it comes down to also, I have to kind of mourn the loss of an academic career that I thought I was going to have. Because I'm really largely leaving it. You know, all that camaraderie and collegiality and all of that, you know, that everybody expects to have in your chosen field. You know, it's not good, it's not meant to have. Clearly I'm not as welcome. So who am I? You know, I'm a second generation Israeli. Both my parents were born in Israel, and they were both served in the army. My mother's parents were both Sephardic. Her father and his family banished from Arab lands in the early 20th century, and my mother and family living in Jerusalem for many generations, originally banished from Spain. My father's side is fully Ashkenazi from Poland. His parents leave Poland in 1922, very early on, as idealistic Zionists, and come to this small strip of land, then known by its Roman name, Palestine. My paternal grandmother was one of 8 children who, all of whom stayed behind and were all murdered in Treblinka. Her father, by the way, was a very prominent rabbi in the Bialystok synagogue who, on June 27th, 1941, was barricaded in that synagogue with at least 1,500 other Jews, and they were all burned alive. I wrote a play about it, and this is the play I want to bring to Montreal. So here they were so now her family's completely gone. Here they were in this new land, drying the swamps, right? Unfortunately, she lost her first 2 twin daughters to malaria. Then 20 years later, she lost her first son to the War of Independence in 1948. This on top of her father, the rabbi. Unfortunately, my father was then a 14-year-old boy. And unfortunately, more so, he actually had to witness the death of his brother, who was 19. So all this is very traumatic. And then enter me, born in the mid-60s to all of this tragedy, a product of all of this tragedy, and all of the subsequent displacement and kind of fragmentation that went on. You know, leaving Israel, going back to Israel, coming to Canada, I lived in Montreal, going to the US, back to Israel, London for a while, back to Israel, etc. And here I am in the diaspora. One of my memories of Montreal, to make this more personal, this is 20 years ago, I was performing in Fiddler on the Roof at the English Language Theatre in Old Montreal. What's it called?
Centaur.
The Centaur Theatre. And every night on stage, you know Fiddler? Fiddler, great music.
Yes, I was Yenta.
You were Yenta?
I was a Yenta.
Oh, you were a Yenta. Okay.
No, I was Yenta in Fiddler on the Roof.
Yes, yes.
Not like some super huge production, but
Right.
a big production.
Yeah. This was at the Centaur, so it was pretty modest, but it was nice. And every night on stage, I would find myself crying during the Anatevka number, because, you know, it's always about leaving. You're always leaving, and then I would cry during the sunrise sunset number. And so it's very difficult to perform, you know, through this cloud of tears. It's very distracting. But there you have it. Flash forward 47 years, and here I am. And all of this crap that I'm telling you about, and there's just so much a guy can take, right? So I decided I'm going to do something about this. But I try not to lash out impulsively. I want to do something clever and premeditated. I thought, what do I have control over? What can I do? My gesture is small. I decided that I was going to write a little one-page addendum to my doctoral dissertation. I decided I was going to ask Penn State, my degree-granting institution, to file it with my manuscript. And I wasn't asking for a big ceremony. I just thought, file it in the middle of the night. I don't care. Just put it there for the legacy of it. In this statement, I decided I would symbolically disavow the writing of one particular philosopher that, since I had finished my dissertation, I kind of saw what her true colors were. And this is Judith Butler, who I'm sure you're familiar with. If you're not familiar with her, she is a professor of rhetoric at Berkeley, and she is a contemporary philosopher. Some people consider her to be, one of the most important living American philosophers today. She's a big hero of academia, but she is violently anti-Israel, and admittedly, by her words, she is pro-Hamas and pro-Hezbollah, and she is Jewish. And so I thought, okay, I used her words in my dissertation. This is my dissertation. I'm going to disown them. I don't want this. I don't want this scholar anymore in my work, because her subsequent positions, I thought, discredited her as a researcher and as a scholar. So, and I've been familiar with, in the last few years, with the movement that she supports, the BDS movement, and I thought, okay, let's be funny, let's be symbolic. I'm going to start my own little movement. With the writing of this addendum, I'm going to call it RDS. Not BDS, but RDS. And that would stand for retractions and disavowals in scholarship. And I'm encouraging, that's what I thought I would do, I would encourage all scholars to go back to their manuscripts and to extricate, symbolically, because you don't have to do it if you don't want to, and they won't let you really change the dissertation because it's a published thing. But you could add a little addendum, and at least just as a symbolic pushback. Now, I won't read you the whole statement, but I can send it to you if you like. I can email it to you, and it does exist online. If you just kind of Google me, you'll
Can you
find
read some of it?
Sure, I'll read some of it. Here's what I say, some of it. The country Butler vilifies is the only thriving democracy in the Middle East where someone like her, a woman, a lesbian, a political agitator, would be protected. The people in whose name she purports to speak, however, would oppress, punish, and possibly put her to death for merely who she is. In light of her selective blindness, it could only be surmised that Butler and her cohorts are operating with a special kind of bias, a scapegoating that is familiar to students of history. To those who would distinguish between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, I go on in my addendum, I retort, there is no difference. To be anti-Israel is to be anti-Jewish. Israel is the Jewish state. Of course, the other great irony is that Butler is Jewish, despite the fact that she seems to have little to no appreciation of her own people's history and the kind of deep memory and moral responsibility that it entails. Instead, she opts to identify with neo-leftist academics and zealous and sanctimonious folks who, go around policing global injustices, even things that they don't know about, but with a special and disproportionate animosity towards Israel. Right? Instead of allowing her own persecuted status as a Jewish lesbian to inform a subtle and empathic interpretation, she preemptively apologizes, in my mind, for her own academic success and social acceptance by self-effacingly criticizing her own people. And this is my, playing Freud here. But a classic and all too common unconscious self-hatred that we see from Marx to Hannah Arendt to Noam Chomsky. To appease her colleagues and to ostensibly ensure her status, she performs this kind of self-righteous academic extracurricular activity. And mind you, she's a professor of rhetoric, not Middle Eastern studies. Unfortunately, Butler's behavior is symptomatic of what I view, and this time as an Israeli, because I can wear those hats, when I want to, a false sense of security that some American and maybe some Canadian Jews have, and especially intellectual ones. Now, 70 years removed from the gas chambers of Europe, as though it can never happen again. Of course, Penn State refused. I had some screaming matches on the phone with the thesis office and the library and the crazy Armenian chair. So, I don't need them. I decided I'm going to disseminate this widely on my own, on the internet and on email. And that's what I did. And, I'm so glad that they refused me, you guys, because what followed was nothing short of amazing. Not only friends and family, but colleagues and, noted figures and other academics, and the responses just started pouring in rather immediately. Phyllis Chesler, a noted New York academic and feminist pioneer, wrote a nice piece about me in the Israel National News. Joshua Levitt, a very respected Columbia journalist in New York, wrote a piece for the Allgemeine. Alan Dershowitz of all people, sends me an email congratulating me for my courage. TLV1, the English language Tel Aviv radio station, calls me and wants to do an interview. I get emails from Australia, from Canada, from England, from Nigeria, Facebook, requests and stuff. I start my own Facebook group, RDS on Facebook. You can look it up and join us. And the last call I get was from this lovely guy named Charles Asher Small, who's the head of ISGAP, this organization that sent me here tonight. And he, out of the blue, right, he doesn't know me, he says, congratulations. He says, that took a lot of courage. I'd like to meet you. I'd like to work with you. And so we met, and now we're working together, and it's so great. Wow, right? I mean, I really touched a nerve. A lot of people responded to this, and I just quickly, I'm coming to the end of my remarks. I want to tell you about one more person, Abby, a young doctoral student at the University of Exeter in England. This poor woman was being forced by her doctoral committee to include just hateful anti-Israel material in her PhD. She was being forced, you cannot pass the oral exams, right? Unless you review this literature that is supposedly, germane to your research, which it was not in her case. And she was she didn't know what to do. She was at the end of her wits. And she contacted me, and I put her in touch with these people that I now suddenly had access to, like Phyllis Chesler and Charles Small. And we rallied around her, and we supported her, and we gave her a context, and we gave her a community. And she's fighting, and she's fighting with greater, tenacity and greater energy. And I'm so happy because I was able to help Abby. Right around this time, Judith Butler was invited to give a talk about Kafka at the Jewish Museum in New York. But now my little one-man movement was circulating. It happened to be right around the same time in the papers in New York, and various community members, some of which sat on the board, started to take on this kind of outrage that I had displayed, and we decided to, that it was not appropriate. It was just not appropriate to have this figure at the Jewish Museum in New York. And she either bowed out or was disinvited, but Judith Butler was not hosted in the following weeks after this all exploded.
I heard that what happened was
Oh, please.
somebody had bought up all the tickets.
Oh,
and
please.
forced her to.
See, I forgot about that. You tell everyone.
No, I just heard that somebody had bought up all the tickets and then called the management and said you either cancel it or she's not going to be speaking to anybody.
Mhm.
And so she ended up canceling it
Uh-huh.
and then said it was of her own volition that she couldn't make it or whatever.
I love that. And right after that, she, in a joint statement with Khalid Rashidi, prominent Palestinian academic, issued this statement complaining about them being censored and them being silenced. And then, lo and behold, the most amazing thing happened when I get the following email. Dear Dahn Hiuni, I'm wondering whether you might be willing to meet for coffee or tea in NYC sometime in April. I'd like a chance to have a conversation with you. I have the sense that we might be able to understand each other better in person, and I would welcome that chance. Signed, Judith Butler.
Oh
Wow.
my God.
Boy.
Oh yeah, oh it is
Where
right.
this is going.
Okay, like I am shaking in my boots, right? Like the most important, like living philosopher is writing me. So what do I do now? And I'm a little afraid of her, right? Like she's in with Hezbollah, Hamas. So I debate, do I meet with her? I asked my family, I asked all my friends, I asked the 100 members of my new group, right? I wanted to be very democratic. I said, should I meet with her? What should I do? And after much debating, and you'll forgive me, I decided that not only was I not going to meet with her, but that I wasn't going to respond to the email because I felt that she went beyond the pale by her support for terrorist organizations, and that the conversation wouldn't go well. And let's face it, she's very brilliant. I was afraid she was going to brainwash me. And I didn't want to do it. I was being stubborn. I don't know if it was the right decision, but that was the decision I made. And I thought, you know what? I've heard enough from Judith Butler. It's time for her to hear a little bit from me. And that's what happened. And I would welcome your responses to that. But I'll finish by saying that you must never, ever, this is a cliche, the cliche of cliches, but it's true. You must never underestimate the power of one individual. Look what happened, right? Look what I did, sitting there alone in my lonely room and with my laptop, writing my little addendum, being all angry and isolated. But deciding to do it, all you need to do is to just decide to do it. And then you do it, and once it's out there, you throw it out there in the world, and it's out there, and things happen. So, my life has changed because of it. I still have half of one foot in academia, just for like some bread and butter courses. But I'm spending significantly more time with this new kind of activism, which in this environment, God knows we need, because things are getting bad, and I have the energy and the willingness to do it. And so here I am doing it. And it's not that unlike a teacher. So here I am before you. And that's the end of my story.
Are you aware that Judith Butler was given an honorary degree from McGill University 2
Oh,
years
for
ago?
sure. From McGill?
Yeah, from McGill.
Oh, I'm not surprised. I wasn't aware of it, but I'm not surprised. Thank you. Bye, guys. I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised. How were you here at the time?
I think this was my graduating class. Fortunately, I was in the science graduates, so I didn't get to hear her.
Mm-hmm.
But all the art students, she was basically the speaker.
Yeah.
She spoke there because she got an honorary degree and she gave the speech. So.
Yeah.
Well, I think it was from the Jewish community, there was a bit of a divided.
There was.
Yeah, so there wasn't a massive protest against it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there was like some opposition, I remember, but it wasn't like huge and it didn't really hold any water, like no one really, like, it didn't take off.
Sure. Yeah. In most people's mind, you know, especially in Canada where everything's so civilized, why would you want to protest an academic? It seemed, and when a day of celebration, it just seems it's not right.
The left will do it when it's, because there's a woman named Margaret Somerville who opposes gay marriage, and she was given an honorary degree at Ryerson, and
Yeah.
the staff and the students turned their back on her,
Yeah.
literally.
Oh, really?
During the
Oh, I love
ceremony.
it. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
We might have to learn a little bit more from gay activism, which is, turns the notch up a little higher with the, please.
Yeah, I moved back to Montreal from New York about 10 years ago. And I didn't have a job, and I started just going around and attending things and reading the internet. And since I had time, I attended quite a few BDS conferences, anti-Israel apartheid conferences, and I even had an interesting experience where I was working for, I was volunteering with the Concordia TV program, which is open to all students.
Sure.
However, when there were at that time anyways, the person who was kicked out when Netanyahu came to Concordia, so
Yeah.
you know who he is. He was at that time heading up this organization, and when he saw me, he said, "No, you cannot attend." I swear to God, this happened. I wrote about it. You can read about it on my blog. And so I'm very, very aware
Yeah.
of everything that's going on. And it's sad. And today on the internet, there was a very interesting article on Mosaic, which analyzes, it's very hard to put your finger on exactly where is this coming from, who is behind it, because it's coming from so many different quarters. And what this Mosaic article is saying is that this is becoming like a social movement, like a grassroots social movement. For example, a few years ago when they had the BDS movement here, so the feminists were pro-Palestinian. I went to a few things where the feminist department of Concordia was completely pro-feminist. Now they have a new head of the feminist department, and she's not like that. But at the time, and also, they claim that the Aboriginals are part of this movement against Israel. And their claims are so bizarre and outrageous, and yet they have traction because people, grassroots individuals, some of them fed by latent anti-Semitism, a lot of them not very well educated, and it's a mob mentality.
Yes.
That, right?
That's exactly.
It's a mob mentality that we really have to speak up for. And
But it's the progressive mob. They see themselves as the progressive mob.
never mind.
Yeah.
I think a few years ago, I don't know if you know about CIJR, Canadian Institute for Jewish Research. So that's a Canadian organization, and over the years they had several conferences, and I've filmed a lot of them, and I put a lot of the films on YouTube. And I remember Mr. Gerstenberg, who came a few years ago, and he said that...
Gerstenfeld?
What?
Is it Manfred Gerstenfeld?
Manfred
Okay.
Gersten, yes. And he gave a very interesting talk, which is on YouTube. And again, he says even a single person can make a difference. For example, he pointed out that there was some petition, this was at the time of one of the wars, on behalf of the Palestinians. And one professor signed it as Nasrallah. You know? In other words, you really have to use humor and ingenuity and to know what you are doing, to really speak up. I'll give you another example. A few months ago, a man called Sam Bick wrote an editorial in the Gazette. It was actually an opinion piece that claimed that Jews don't have any national interest in Israel, especially Jews from Arabic lands, and a lot of this nonsense. And it turns out that this Sam Bick went to a Jewish school right here in Montreal. Of course, he doesn't also say that he also wrote for Electronic Intifada and Tadamon, both of them. You can Google his name and you see it right away, but most people don't see that.
How does a good little Jewish boy from a Jewish school end up doing that? Like, it doesn't make sense.
Where do they lose their way?
How do they do it? I know.
I was kicked out of I was running was part of the feminist organization at McGill, so BDS, and I was running this discussion talk about feminist issues, and I started eventually getting involved in the pro-Israel community and started, I was part of the opt-out campaign for Cuba because of their anti-Israel stance. And so they immediately told me, you don't have the authority to talk about feminist issues because you don't understand oppression clearly, because you don't sympathize with Palestinian oppression. And they said, like, we need someone who has expertise in that area and who will be able to academically discern,
Exactly.
and understand the intersectionality that is involved. And so they basically think that they're the whole bubble, like they're in this bubble that they think that they're the only people that make any sense, and everyone else is just stupid, ignorant, homophobic, sexist, or racist. And so,
But so the Palestinian conflict is central to the feminist.
They didn't tell me that it had anything to do with that.
But you see, they systematically excluded her because she didn't agree with their.
But they didn't tell me that was why. But they told me that you're support of the opt-out campaign, and I literally specifically said that my support is because of the Israel-Palestine issue. Because they support this, like they do Israel apartheid, like they're the people that run it, and I have a moral issue with that. And so they literally were like, yeah, we can't, because you obviously don't understand oppression, and et cetera. So they kicked me out.
Yeah, I mean, if you support Israel, right, you are supporting an oppressor. You're supporting, and what they see as in their lingo, it's a colonialist kind of imperialist oppressor. And so you cannot understand feminism by definition, by nature. You cannot. These two causes are completely irreconcilable. Right? You cannot fight oppression on the one hand and be an oppressor on the other.
That's exactly what they told me, sort of.
Please.
Yeah, so I have a question,
Please.
taking it in another direction maybe. What do you see a place for politics in academics? Or do you think that it should be something separate?
No, absolutely. I think that you cannot separate politics from any aspect of life, and certainly not from academia. So I'm all for rigorous politicization, and it's you can't avoid it of education. My dissertation, my doctoral studies was about critical pedagogy. It's kind of like the reconciliation of education and activism and politics, and so I'm all for it. I'm against crazy people, So we have to find a way to kind of bring up our politics and to be able to cultivate a community and a sophisticated dialogue that counters it, because you cannot silence people, especially if it's in academia, right? But what we can do is fight back, and we have to attack. And as Ruth Weiss says, do you know Ruth Weiss? She's fabulous. You have to look her up. She's at Yale. She says, we cannot afford to constantly be put in this position of defendant. We have to attack back. We have to be more active about it. But I have no problem, in essence, obviously, with what you're saying.
Right.
What do you
just
think about that?
Like, or as a follow-up, last year, I think I went to a lecture by professors here at McGill where they were discussing their silencing of speaking out against Israel.
They're being
That
silenced?
they're being silenced because they feel that whenever they do that,
Mhm.
it's equated with anti-Semitism, and that they were forming their own little community. I went there, I wanted to see what they had to say.
Yeah.
And they said the academic environment is one where, when you bring up your political opinions, then it puts your job at stake.
Yeah.
So just
Only if they're the wrong opinions.
Oh,
no, but here they were saying that even if they have
yeah.
other opinions, that like it all kind of gets.
I may have
muddled up.
misunderstood
They
your
did a
question.
poll of Harvard professors,
Hmm.
and not, like, less than 8% were voting Republican.
Yeah.
95% vote,
Yeah.
the leftist Democratic, and that's true of, in our schools too. They vote
Yeah.
left-wing parties, and
Of course.
and most of these left-wing parties are anti-Israel. They had a large conference in Ottawa about 2 weeks ago, the large socialist conference, and there were multiple sessions. One of my friends went to see what they were talking about, various anti-Israel things. How do we get the one-state solution for Palestine being Palestine? So.
Right. But just to follow up, I didn't, when I meant politics and education, I thought you meant in the classroom. Like to talk about it and to incorporate it into. But yeah, of course you cannot, wear your politics on your sleeve at the cocktail party or at the, faculty committee meeting because, I did and it's academic suicide and, it's over. So, but for me, I had nothing else to lose. So I knew that my future was not in academia anymore. I'm gonna, take my PhD and do something else with it.
Well, were you weren't necessarily, your purpose was not to be political, your purpose was to respond to what you perceived
Absolutely.
was a politicization.
I was not trying to be political.
That's
Yeah,
it.
that's true.
And I think that's
true.
what you were saying was
Yeah.
that, when universities, when, 98 or 92% of faculty
Yeah,
are voting one way, then you're not.
not much
sort of-
diversity there.
Yeah.
Please, you were gonna say.
Another thing that I noticed about conflating politics with academia is that the thing about academia is doing research, right? So you're finding these evidence, right? And you're coming to conclusions using this evidence. So technically we would call it the scientific method, although, that's a very loose term, in the arts a little bit.
Sure.
So I find that a lot of academia is like what they think is finding the truth, quote unquote. So because they're so convinced of the truth and because they use this method to come to the truth, they think that they know the truth, and if you disagree with them, then you're ignorant and you're denying the truth because you have an agenda. So that is the biggest issue. That's what causes all these clashes because they think that they're so, knowledgeable. And the liberal bias in academia right now, I think, they tried the pro-Palestinian contingent is really capitalizing on that to make it seem like they're the majority on campus. Like they are, they're the majority, so you should just jump on the bandwagon because then you're cool, then you're like everyone else and you're like all the cool, in the know, sapient human beings, at the university. And so that's the problem is that they create the illusion, and I know they're doing that at McGill right now, that, the SMU, that everyone hates Israel. This is a common belief. Everyone disagrees with Israel. It's
There's
being
a vote.
human.
Yeah.
There's a vote tomorrow.
There's a vote. There's a resolution.
It was postponed a couple of times, most recent
So who
time.
put that resolution forward?
SPHR.
SDH.
Oh, yeah, they had a conference.
Yeah, actually, it's still the Solidarity for Palestinian Human Rights, and it's tabling at McGill on Wednesday. So basically what they're trying to argue, they're literally blaming Israel for the entire conflict. They're like, we condemn Israel for this, we condemn Israel for that, we condemn Israel for this. And they don't mention Palestine, they don't mention Hamas, they just mention Israel.
I think they don't mention the Durban conference.
They
Well,
don't
it's like the letter
mention
in the Lancet.
anything.
Or the letter in the Lancet.
Yeah, the letter in the Lancet, Richard Horton retracted it when he went
That's
to go
right.
visit.
Amazing.
Yeah, he went to go visit
Yeah,
Rambam
right.
and he saw that a quarter of the doctors there are Arab,
Yeah.
which was completely contrary to what they published in their letter, and he's going to publish in a
Have you noticed how
retraction.
many retractions?
It's
But
more
the
than a
week
quarter of
before
their-
that, he said he
no
would
way
never
it's only
publish a
quarter.
retraction. That's the best part about it.
Yeah.
When they also had allegations of the two major writers of it. They found emails from them
They were
about like,
Nazis.
yeah,
They were Nazis, they were out
there were videos like from
Nazis.
David Duke about the Zionists controlling the media, and their response was like, I don't agree with Israelis and the majority of Jews. The other one said, I thought it was true, so I was scared. These are two like doctors, educated doctors.
Yeah,
So two of my
One's
colleagues.
One's
David
Italian, one I
Duke.
think is Thai.
Yeah.
you didn't even, wait, Dr. Eben, you didn't read about that?
Yeah, yeah.
You
Yeah, I
did?
signed the counter letter.
I know, I know that said
Yeah, I
it
read
to
it
you.
once or twice.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah. So, you know, I think we, I don't know if everybody knows this, about how this all came to pass via the Durban Conference, where the first UN Human Rights Conference decided that Zionism is racism. I mean, that's the core. And everything since then, you know, is sprung from there.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lie, which was later retracted, but it doesn't make any difference to the Palestinian support
Just like the
groups.
Goldstone report, you know, it was retracted, but everyone's
Everyone's
citing it
retracting.
for some
Yeah.
reason, you know, it's like,
Yeah.
We know who
he is
Goldstone
a
is.
Jewish traitor, basically, yeah.
He's a judge from South Africa who was asked to do a report on.
Yes, but my point is, he's Jewish.
Yes, he is Jewish. Yes, he is Jewish.
You know,
That's not,
Chomsky is
that's not
Jewish, Butler
new.
is Jewish.
That's not new, by the
I
way.
don't-
Look at Hannah Arendt. I mean, Judith Butler is like the contemporary Hannah Arendt. And by the way, Hannah Arendt has been, although she was a brilliant professor and a brilliant philosopher, she has now been discredited, especially in her views about acne. Totally discredited. So, you know, this is not, just because they're Jewish doesn't mean they
So
they
I
understand.
would say, honestly, I think the Jew who is anti-Israel is like a chicken supporting KFC. You know,
That's
think
a
about
better
it.
one.
A
Yeah.
chicken,
But-
explain
A
what
Jew
you
who is
mean.
anti-Israel is like a chicken supporting KFC. You know, KFC is known for their horrible treatment of chickens. They genetically modify chickens to have like 5 heads and like 3 breasts and like all this crazy stuff, and they're just notorious
And then they
I
kill
like that, I
abuse
like
of
that.
chickens.
I like that.
Like
Please,
notorious.
this gentleman has a,
Yes.
please.
Yes, so as a comment, that when we meld, let's say, our academic persuasions with our political persuasions, be a little bit judicious. I'm going to start with people like Gadamer, Heidegger. A little bit of sensitivity has to be met with an understanding these people's perspective. They are human after all, subject to the frailties, and one of those frailties unfortunately happens to be self-promotion and propagation of their ideals. Heidegger and Gadamer would not have been as successful as they are today had they condemned the Nazi regime. And we see the same thing happening with Bertrand Russell many years later. Today we see Alain Badiou doing the same thing, using political pretexts, which are not necessarily woven into the tapestry of their intellectual beliefs, manifesting themselves as a mechanism for promoting their status. These individuals arrive at their conclusions through liberal tendencies rather than liberal thinking. And I'd like to differentiate between the two. Liberal thinking is a process which entertains a wide spectrum of viewpoints with the purpose of reaching a beneficial conclusion, one that is as close to the truth that there is no ability to establish the truth, but we can try to approximate as much as possible. The liberal tendency is the tendency to try to equilibrate society by bringing those who are on the high ground, those in power down and bringing the weak and the underprivileged up in society, and that's exactly the case we have here in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
That's what you call a liberal tendency.
A liberal tendency, yes.
Supporting the underdog blindly, no matter what.
Exactly. I'm just going to take a poll right now. How many people here, let's say 15 years ago, I'm not sure, those who did, supported the KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army?
But I don't know if it's a socialist impulse or a genocidal impulse. You seem to be saying it's like a socialist impulse, but
Yes.
it's very much a genocidal impulse. It's not an equilibration of, you know, if I understand correctly. You're saying it's kind of like to balance the imbalances in society.
Yes, those who are, let's say, underprivileged in society are usually supported by the liberal.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Those,
yeah, sorry.
you disagree with that perspective?
No, I disagree with the application to this particular situation.
To the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Was it not a similar situation in the case of the KLA, where, of course, that one was really got out of control, but there was exacerbation. We have to understand that. It would not have reached its crescendo.
I don't think a lot of people know what the KLA was.
I said, well, it was a terrorist organization. It was a terrorist organization that was actually buffeted, funded through terrorist organization, through a terrorist means, meaning through drug running and other, just like Hezbollah, in order to displace sovereign power from a particular territory. There was even talk about Greater Albania at the time. And of course, the liberal media painted that. I don't know whether we consider BBC to be liberal or conservative.
It's not conservative.
I consider, I think we have to go.
Conservative, that's like, no.
Well,
It depends.
I see your distinction, though. It's very, very instrumental. What were you going to say to add?
I think your distinction is very valid, you
Yeah.
know. Liberal thought is one thing,
Mhm.
and what we hear as liberal politics is something else. And liberal politics is really an extension of the Marxian idea.
Yeah.
And Marx himself was a Jew, and he's been
Unfortunately.
totally discredited by history, but the leftists continue to espouse many of his ideas.
Actually, I was talking to Dr. Eatman earlier about this, but so people say that the conservatives only care about you if you're either like unborn or religious, unless you're like if you're unborn or religious. I would say that the liberals only care about you if you're disenfranchised and a person of color. You know, so
Well,
like
of course.
so it's really like I guess I'm born and I'm a woman who is
Lesbian, yes.
no, I'm not lesbian.
No, I mean Judith Butler.
If you're not an underclass,
Nobody cares
you're not
about me.
appreciated.
Yeah.
What
You
a
fall
friendship.
between the cracks. I'm so sorry.
I'd just like to share one more thing. I have a friend, her name is Elsa. She was a professor at Concordia, and she had to stop teaching because she said her students were totally unable to think for themselves.
Yeah.
That, this relativistic idea that is taught throughout the secular system was so
Relativist, not
ingrained.
relativistic.
Relativist.
Relativistic is the speed of life. Yeah.
Relativism was so pronounced that nobody could actually think for themselves. And I think that's a part of it too.
I have a friend who's a famous blogger who says the opposite of diversity is university. Because that's what's happened, because now,
Universalism.
so we
Yeah.
don't see all the viewpoints now at universities anymore. We don't.
Well, we need academies instead of universities.
Yeah.
Universities are
Exactly.
hubs for bureaucracy. An academy would be an open forum for
Open forum.
intellectual
So
discussion.
I have no problem with people espousing their pro-Palestinian, but they should allow the other side to also give their side. And they should both be able to
And there should
debate
be
in a
free-
calm, free, that's not what happens anymore.
Yeah, they
Let
act
me
like
tell you, that's not what happens. If you speak up at one of these meetings, they shut you down if you're not, if you're not.
Look at Dr. Norman. Yes.
They treat me, first they try and discredit me. They try to tell me, oh, you have no idea what you're talking about, because you didn't serve in the IDF, you didn't do X, Y, Z, you're not a real Israeli, you're not this, you're just whatever. Then they were just telling me that I'm stupid, ignorant, and naive. So they just make me feel like I'm the most naive little princess, this naive little white privileged princess.
Jewish.
Yeah. No, not like they
I don't know if you're Jewish or not.
somehow
but-
my cis hetero white privilege somehow managed to get into this debate. I don't know how, but it does.
How can we make you oppressed?
Well, I mean, I belong to several groups
Join in on
that
it.
oppressed, but like.
No, I don't mean to make light of it, I fully understand that, but
But
I
if you
think
say
that
you're
it,
oppressed all the time,
Yeah.
you end up failing. You know, don't be oppressed.
No.
Self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
no, I think it
exactly.
would be very interesting for you, to show your various constituencies and communities that you might belong to, that there are some ambiguities and contradictions
But, yeah.
in the world, and that you can be one and the other, and that, because what you're dealing with is a form of fundamentalism at the feminist, which is directly opposite to what they're trying to do.
Actually, at the debates, so there's like a big debate on Facebook now because there's the resolution on Wednesday, and so some person was like, "Oh my God, the way the Israelis they're so racist against the Ethiopians, like it's terrible, it needs to be condemned as well. No, this isn't just about Palestine."
They don't know that they
Yeah,
saved the
they're
whole
like-
Ethiopian
no, they're
community.
like-
The government did,
They're
but
basically
the
like-
populace was
No,
not.
they're basically like, oh, like it's it's not just about Palestine. It's Israel's just a horrible country in general, and like this, YZ. And so this
Which country is it
Ethiopian,
horrible?
this Ethiopian Jew comes on and is like, "Hi guys, I'm an Ethiopian Jew. I'm not oppressed. Shut up." Well, I mean, in a much nicer
That's exactly
and
what we need.
more eloquent, like very well thought out response. And so. That would be
I
great.
find white liberals are only too eager to put themselves in, to defend, because I happen to be gay, I'm brown, and people are always saying, "Oh, are you oppressed?" No, I've never been oppressed, I'm fine.
Oh, we have to admit with the Falashes that there were mistakes.
Yes, but there are
There
mistakes
were-
for everything, you
There are
can't be
mistakes
Of course.
everywhere.
Of course, but by bringing them to the fore, that's how we do the rehabilitation. That's how we improve ourselves.
But if you spend your whole life saying you're oppressed, you're gonna end up nowhere.
And
The oppressed
there-
man is always a prisoner of his own chains.
Yes, exactly. So you have to release yourself.
Yes.
I'm
It is
wondering
a
if some
liberty
of
of power, that's what he is.
Some of the other nice folks who are here haven't had a chance to speak to you. Do you want to say hi, or do you want to tell us a little bit about your studies or experiences with any of this? And anyone else want to? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but if you wanted to. I'm always curious to hear about when I go to visit, what's going on other campuses. So, it's always very interesting to hear.
Well, I want to just bring another question.
Sure.
I started asking, if our position on Judith Butler is such, how do we evaluate others? How do we evaluate, how do we Gadamer and how do we address those? Do
Yeah.
we completely abolish all of their, what I would say, commendable
Yes.
thoughts and contributions to society just because they had this feeling
Mhm.
that prevented them from accepting reality? They probably knew in their heart was wrong. I'm sure Judith Butler knows very well that her positions are not synchronized with the rest of her philosophy.
Yes.
It's probably akin to her lesbianism. It's probably taking that type of aesthetic, that type of feminist doctrine, and taking it to the extreme. She's probably trying to associate maybe some of Simone de Beauvoir's views with the Palestinians and actually feminize them in order to find some sort of commonality. That's where she's probably coming from. But do we
So
take?
she's favoring her lesbianism against her own
I
Judaism.
think so. I see that.
But
as
it's
a
That
common
makes
point.
sense, because
That's
No,
not an
that-
academic
He's right,
position,
he's right.
you know.
But
that's-
it's really
Sorry.
interesting. You're like, you have
So,
to
a
tear
lot-
yourself apart.
A lot of Jews have a tradition of being on the left, and some of the Jews have chosen being a leftist more than being Jewish.
Yes,
That's
And I
exactly.
think that's happened, and I think he's right with what he just
Yeah.
said.
But lesbian doesn't necessarily mean left. You can have gay people on
No.
the right, gay people on the left.
That's true, we have gay
The
Republicans.
rise is the important
You know,
word.
I mean, also, like, lesbians are accepted in Israel and nowhere else in the Middle East, so like, yeah, I don't
Yeah.
think it's really her lesbianism in
Yeah,
question.
that's fine,
It's
but
the
you know, who
leftist.
started Queers for Israeli Apartheid was in Toronto somewhere.
Yeah.
That's, I mean, that's a really interesting question, is like, what happens when you have someone whose research or work you would otherwise like, but that they hold, vile views? And in fact, it's happening tonight at the Metropolitan Opera, you know? Do we listen to this beautiful music?
Absolutely, that's right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's art, and art has the potential to express anything. Whether or not you agree or disagree is not important. You, as the viewer, as the interpreter, have to impose your own interpretation of the expression. That's the communication between the artist and the viewer.
Even if it offends you terribly.
You have to accept offense, because life, every day, we find things offensive. It's
Why does art
impossible
get a free
to.
pass?
Pardon?
Why do you have to read?
Well, I don't also agree
Why
with,
do you-
Israel had a policy of not playing Wagner for
That's
several
absolutely
years.
That's interesting, why does art get a free pass? As long as you aestheticize it and call it art, then, maybe we can tolerate it more than what? Than academic,
Yeah, I
or
mean,
other forms of representation?
Some art gets away with it.
As long as it's intellectually honest. And art is completely subjective. But as long as it's intellectually honest, in other words, the individual's not try to how do you say, betray perceptions by imposing an overhanging aesthetic, then I think it's acceptable. For example, if someone feels, and there are many depictions, I can't remember the names of the artists, who depict Holocaust scenes in their artwork. It's perfectly acceptable and can be interpreted many different ways, so long as it doesn't corrupt perception. Then that's completely acceptable. And Wagner he does not send any particular anti-Semitic viewpoint in his operas. He might have written a treaty which, I question whether it was anti-Semitic. Certainly it was against Jewish culture and its imposition in Germany. Be careful, you have distinguished between Cosima and Eva as well as Richard Wagner. They're not the same. Richard Wagner had many Jewish friends. He hired many Jews. He was well integrated with Jews. Even Meyerbeer supported him, and Meyerbeer was offended actually when he wrote this treatise that said that the Jewish contributions to Jewish culture were degenerate. But he was not against the people. He was against he was really a German supremacist more than an anti-Jew or an anti-Semite. So you have to be careful. It's true that his views were exploited by the Nazis, by his son-in-law, who was incidentally not German but English. But we have to appreciate his art in its own right, and we also have to be careful to understand when individuals are used as icons for certain causes. Maybe it's better to take a deeper look at who they are and what they really believe.
That's a good point.
I disagree though. Well, I disagree because I think that, I don't know, for some reason when it comes to, Holocaust, people sort of, there's a little bit of confusion. For example, would it be acceptable to have an opera, the Metropolitan Opera, it's on, let's say, the glorification of the beheading of James Foley? Is that art?
There's an opera called The Advance of the Carmelites, where at the last scene, each Carmelite is beheaded.
But the thing
And
is,
you have
when you're, but if
John
you're
Baptist.
going to, if you're going to,
And Herodias.
I think you have to take into account cultural sensitivities. And I think that, to have an opera that celebrates terrorism against Americans, and this opera is being funded by these Americans, I think it's I think that there's a point where it's just gone wrong, it's gone off the rails.
Before this December, was made into an opera too. It's
You know,
did
so
a
like-
lot.
So people can have intellectual discussions, but at the end of the day, you know, when you have an opera that is glorifying something evil, you know, something very bad, I think what happens is society becomes a little bit confused and distorted.
Be careful. You're starting to encroach on liberal thinking here, because one world's freedom fighters are the other world's terrorists, and
That's
if we're
not
not,
true, that's not true.
it's always true.
No, because in the West, we have certain values. We have certain values, the values of liberty, the values, I mean, we have a constitution, and people who live here abide by a social contract. So if you're not gonna abide by a social contract of liberty and justice for all, where equal rights of citizenship, where there are gay rights, where people are equal, then you know, that's your right. But to take what I'm offended by is that, you know, it's one thing to have, you know, an opera glorifying terrorism on some street corner with some guy that decides to, you know, do a one-man show. But it's another thing to take the most prestigious cultural institution in the United States and to have that normalize anti-Semitism.
Yes.
I think Ezra
Sanctions.
Zilka still, he signed off on that one. I think he didn't pull his sponsorship thing off.
Who
Ezra
is
Zilka. Ezra Zilka, he's a Jew of Oriental extraction.
Well, 90% of the Met supporters are Jewish.
Yes,
This is the
I believe he did not pull it, and he's very prominent. But one more thing, I have to caution you that just because someone does not share the worldview of the society that he lives in, does not mean that he should be culturally excluded. After all, the whole idea of equality means that we encompass and embrace everyone if they have a different worldview. And
No,
they're
but we don't
respected.
encompass and we don't embrace terrorism. We don't. We don't embrace terrorism. We don't embrace beheadings. We don't. It's a reality.
But
it can
we-
happen,
we-
but we don't make an opera about it.
But-
In
but-
the highest
but-
culture
but-
institutions.
But we do some things. Man by nature also does vile things. Regardless of his nationality, the United States did some terrible things in Central America. We remember that. And supposedly that was a culture, a society that did not embrace those values. But they did it anyhow, which is worse. It's worse to be a hypocrite pandering the values of democracy than to be a terrorist who's actually embracing those values and doing it. So we have to be careful here. If we want to be inclusive, we accept all values, all perspectives.
We
We
don't
don't-
accept all.
We don't accept the acts.
Well, you
We
don't,
can't accept the acts.
you don't tolerate
But
intolerance. I mean, and I think put it on the plate.
the viewpoint, then there's no discussion.
The backdrop of this is the elephant in the room is anti-Semitism itself.
Racism in general, human
It's
hatred.
not racism, it's anti-Semitism.
You look like you disagree.
I beg your pardon?
I didn't react to what you
No.
just said. It's too complicated that I can even articulate it. The issue of anti-Semitism. But your declaration of faith certainly made me react that this continent or the US is a land, or Canada for that matter, is land of liberty and justice. I mean, in this country, maybe 20% have access to the justice system. You cannot have justice
Less
in
than
a
20,
system
right.
where maybe 80% are excluded to have access to the justice
Very
system.
good.
But it's still
Very
an ideal. It's still.
It
it's
is not
still-
the ideal.
ideal.
There are
So where would you
mechanisms-
like to live?
there
It's
are
an ideal, it's not
mechanisms
realized.
Where
in
would
that
you like to
idea
live?
which make
How many-
that
what
the
percent-
people
I
are
come from a country
excluded
where you could
to
buy
have.
a judge.
The only thing I'm trying to say is you threw in a fiction of such magnitude,
Excellent.
translating your total unawareness of what North America is all about, what the world is all about.
What's the,
I try to be polite, I don't want to say.
Australia and Canada are countries that
frightening.
oppress their own
What's the fiction?
Aboriginal populations.
Well, you see, I mean, how can I mean, you are totally unaware of your unawareness. Where shall I start?
Are you saying,
Where shall I start?
well, I'd like to
Well,
know,
how
I would
much-
start
How
somewhere.
much access to justice do Saudi Arabians have? How much access to
It
justice?
depends. It
You
depends
would
where
be
on the social
surprised
scale.
that in non-modern
It was a year
societies,
ago.
Oh my God.
whichever these societies are, there's something called communal or religious justice, access to which
Is it,
usually does not take economic means, okay? It's not based on economics.
This is in very small societies. In
In
very
smaller societies,
yes,
in
undeveloped
traditional
societies.
societies.
In Africa, we
Including
still have many
Muslim
things.
societies, Jewish societies.
Animist
and
societies.
And in Africa, in most of Africa. Sorry, I mean.
So some of the
No,
penalties in
I
those
think-
It
societies
is very
are
important
stoning.
because by positing what you posited, you then went further, and from there you somehow implicitly drew conclusions and judged others.
Exactly.
everybody,
By,
have started
in, other
asking,
words,
this is the
in
problem.
other words, there was a self-righteousness,
Well,
implicit.
I'm not saying
I-
that
I'm
there's
saying
not,
it because it's
Oh, that's fine,
partly
that's-
to
that's
what
fine.
many people react to, which you would probably then call anti-Semitism, among other things.
Excuse me,
Yes,
I
there
don't
is
think
an
so.
issue there.
okay.
I don't think I would call that anti-Semitism. I think I call anti-Semitism an unconscious or conscious hostility to Jews in Israel. That's what I call anti-Semitism.
But I think there's a distinction also between reality, there's a rule of law, let's say, and then do people live up to that rule of law? Do people live up to the ideals on which this country is founded? No, they don't. On that, I agree with you 1,000%. There's a lot of injustice. A lot of people don't have access to the justice system. A lot of people don't have access to what they're supposed to according to the law. I'm not disagreeing with you.
We have to.
But you
fine,
can't, but
but
you cannot
then-
equate, I just want to finish my sentence.
Okay,
You cannot equate
yes.
a society that is built on democratic principles and freedom with a society that enslaves women as a rule of law, or and doesn't.
But what does that mean?
What does that
Democracy
mean?
It's a
and
very
freedom?
big
Freedom
distinction.
basically
Okay, but-
means,
okay.
freedom means, and boils down to, in actuality and ultimately, certainly in the West, I'm not responsible for you.
okay
That's all.
guys, I have a question.
I
I'm
will
not
Please
responsible
go.
for my
Okay,
next
That's
life.
not
That's
true.
all what it
That's
boils
not
down
true.
to.
And wait, and let me say, we have like another 5 minutes.
Okay.
So we could also wrap.
I'm going to respond
So-
directly to that point very quickly. I would argue that everyone has some sort of unconscious hostilities towards some individuals, some stereotypes. It's unavoidable. It's actually the precept of self-actualization. And if we're not able to admit this to ourselves, then we don't stand a chance of fighting our natural tendencies. And that's what makes this whole concept that we are of the greatest power because we identify anti-Semitism. Well, unfortunately, this human hatred exists in all of us. There is some ethnicity or some social status or some behavior that everyone finds undesirable, and we act on that. So if we don't admit that to ourselves,
Excuse me,
Please,
excuse me,
let her answer.
excuse me. You know, of course, I'm a social worker and psychologist by profession.
yes, so now you
So
can.
I do understand about
Of
the
course.
unconscious, but I also am a student of history, and I know what anti-Semitism is. And anti-Semitism has been an organized and dogmatic ideology against Jews, an ideology that says Jews are all in power, they're trying to take over the government. Lies, systematic lies, that's what I call anti-Semitism. And a large part of the left is also imbued with systematic lies.
But don't we also possess these same types of, many of us have the same attitudes towards Arabs?
So
Many
what?
of us.
We don't act on it. We don't go out and kill ours.
We're higher
We
up on
don't
the
kill
social
ours. We
scale.
don't go out and kill ours.
You
We're
are-
Okay.
Turn
Hey,
off
everybody,
the
can I just
signs.
say
We're more
something?
developed. We're more
Can
educated.
I just ask a question? So
But what-
where does free speech end and it should we, wait, so democratic societies are built on the concept of tolerance and equality, right? But where do we draw the line between being an oxymoron, aka tolerating intolerance? You know what I mean? So like, tolerating intolerance is an oxymoron. So where do we draw that line? And I think that the death of Klinghoffer kind of crosses that line, you know, in tolerating intolerance. That's what we're doing if we tolerate it. Does
And
that-
I invite you all to continue this conversation at the next, November 7th,
November 3rd,
3rd.
Tammy Rossman Benjamin will be speaking.
So they condemned the freedom fighters in the Spanish Civil War too.
I can't believe
What's November 3rd?
All right. Thank you. Thank you all.
But it's right, it's only to apply to yourself. You have to impose right upon yourself.